Hello and welcome to this session in which we will discuss the reliability of audit evidence and the cost of audit evidence. In the prior session, we learned about the 8 types of audit evidence, which are inquiries of client, inspection, physical examination, observation, recalculation, confirmation, analytical procedures, and performance. Remember, not all audit evidence is the same. There is, depending on the source of the evidence, the effectiveness of the internal control, the auditor's direct knowledge, the qualification of the person providing the audit evidence, and the objectivity of the evidence itself. So in this session, we're going to look at the type of the evidence and basically determine how reliable that evidence from the various perspectives, whether independence of provider, effectiveness of internal control, so on and so forth. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, farhatlectures.com.
Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today.
Starting with inquiries of clients. When you ask client questions, when it comes to the independence of providers of the client, is this low or high? I would say low. The client is providing the evidence. From an independence perspective, we have to assume that the client is biased. Therefore, from an independence provider, it's low. Effectiveness of internal control. Well, here the internal control is not an issue because we are talking to the client, we're relying or we are evaluating their claim. Auditor's direct knowledge is also low. The reason we're asking the client is to learn. Therefore, from the auditor's direct knowledge, we consider this low. Qualification of provider. Well, it all depends. Who are we discussing the issue with? Are we discussing the issue with the CEO, CFO, or are we discussing the issue with the secretary? So it all varies on the person, the qualification of the person providing the information. How about the objectivity of the evidence? Well, the objectivity, it varies, but usually it should be low, but it could be high depending who are we talking to, can we trust this individual, so on and so forth. But usually it varies, but usually I would say low because there's always that independence issue that's gonna trump objectivity. Now we're gonna discuss cost later, but the cost of inquiries of client is usually low, basically talking to them. Inspection, which is, remember when we said inspection, we said inspection physical documents. Well, independence of providers, it all depends whether the documents that we are inspecting is external or internal. If it's external, it has a higher level of confidence than internal document. How about effectiveness of internal control? Would it affect the inspection of documents? Absolutely. If the documents generated from a good internal control, then we have more trust in that document versus weak internal control. Auditor's direct knowledge, we really don't know much because that's why we are inspecting the document. Qualification of providers, it depends who's providing you this information. Again, external is better than internal, and within internal is the person qualified. Objectivity of evidence, it depends. Is it internal document or external document? And the cost is moderate, and we'll explain why later. Physical examination. What's the difference between inspection and physical examination? Inspection, when you are looking at a document, by itself don't have any intrinsic value. Physical examination is when you physically inspect, look, touch a tangible asset, a computer, a piece of equipment, a vehicle, a truck, so on and so forth. So the independence of provider is high because you are performing this physical examination. You are, it means your hands, your eyes is seeing, your hands are touching this asset. Effectiveness of internal control, it all depends. Internal control is the effectiveness of it. If the control is high, then it's good effective internal control. Otherwise, if we are relying on assets that have low internal control, then it's not good internal control. Auditor's direct knowledge, assuming we are expert in what we are discussing, and that's what we assume, then it's high. we always assume it's high. Otherwise, if we are not expert, let's assume we are inspecting gold. Well, we might have to bring an expert. So in other words, we always assume the auditor's direct knowledge is high, because when we are physically examining something, we are giving assurance to ourselves. So we have to be very careful. The qualification of the provider is also has to be high. Again, usually the auditor is performing, therefore the qualification high, or an expert. The objectivity of evidence is also high, assuming you know what you are talking about, then it's high. So notice, physical examination, assuming you have good internal control, it's a good evidence. Notice it's independence of provider high, auditor's direct knowledge is high, the qualification is high, and the objectivity is high. As long as the internal control is good, this is a good type of evidence. And the cost is high though. Physical examination is high, and we'll talk about why later. Observation. Observation is when you're looking. Well, who's looking? The auditor. Usually it's high because the auditor in person. But remember, although we are observing, if the client know we are observing, they might act differently. They might do what they're supposed to be doing. Effectiveness of internal control, it varies, because we really don't know. If internal control is good, then the observation is a good source of evidence. Auditor's direct knowledge is high. You are viewing yourself. You are observing yourself, and you should know what you are observing. Qualification, also high, because the auditor is carrying this step. Objectivity of evidence, normally high, but remember, observation, again, it's specific to a period of time. So you cannot basically say because they were doing this step, they were following internal control. When I was watching, it doesn't mean they're constantly doing it. So normally is high, but you are using your eyes, and if they know you are watching, they might do it only for that time. However, the cost is low, because observing is basically, you can do it, walk around. There's not much you are doing other than observing. So cost is low. Recalculation. Recalculation, who's performing the recalculation? The auditor. Therefore, from an independence perspective, it's high. Well, internal control, it all depends. If the internal control is good, then your recalculation is better because you are relying on good numbers. Auditor's direct knowledge is good. You are performing the recalculation. Qualification of the provider, you are performing it. It's high. Objectivity of evidence is high, again, assuming the numbers are good from the internal control. So notice, recalculation is high on independence of provider, high on direct knowledge, high on the qualification of the provider, and high on objectivity. We just want to make sure internal control is good. And the cost is low. Performing recalculation could be done in Excel or a software. Confirmation. The independence of the provider. Who's going to give you this confirmation? An outside party, the bank or the customer. Therefore, it's high. The effectiveness of the company's internal control, it's not relevant because it's coming from the outside. Now, the provider's internal control is relevant, but we're not talking about this. Auditor's direct knowledge, we really don't know anything about this. That's why we are requesting a confirmation. Qualification of the provider of this confirmation, usually high. Whether it's a bank or a customer, usually it's high. Objectivity of evidence is really high as well, because it's coming from a third party. However, confirmation is costly. So notice, confirmation is like physical examination, high on independence, high on qualification of provider, and high on objectivity. This is good evidence. Analytical procedures, who's performing it? The auditor. However, the auditor is performing, but the client is responding, because you're going to be inquiring after you perform the analytical procedures. And we talked about a lot about analytical procedures, where you have to ask questions. So then you have to rely on their answers. Effectiveness of internal control, important, so it varies. So if the internal control is good, providing good numbers, then analytical procedures are good. Auditor's direct knowledge, well, low. You are trying to understand what's happening. Qualification is normally high because we are providing the service, but remember, the client is supplementing the answer. Objectivity of evidence, usually it varies depending on the reliability of the data, and the reliability of the data depend on how good is their internal control, because you are using their numbers. Cost is moderate. Reperformance, you are reperformance the step. Who's doing it? The auditor. Therefore, independence is high. How good is the internal control? It varies. So you really want, so notice, what do we know about internal control? It varies. Internal control, it varies. It means what? It means it all depends on the internal control of the client. Auditor's direct knowledge should be high. You should know what you are doing when you are reperforming the steps. That's why you are reperforming the step. The qualification of the provider also high, because you should know what you are looking for. You should know what you are doing as an auditor. The objectivity of the evidence also high, but remember, you might be reperforming. It doesn't mean they're doing the same thing, but that's how they do it. It doesn't mean they're doing it the same way every time processing the transaction. The cost is moderate. So it's very important to understand the relationship between the audit evidence and the reliability, the hierarchy of the reliability. Now let's talk about the cost. We said the most expensive were physical examination and confirmation. Let's discuss why. Well, physical examination is when you inspect the physical asset. You have to be there. Sometimes you have to travel. Sometimes you have to spend time counting the asset. And you have to coordinate this effort with the client. Therefore, physical examination is expensive. Confirmation, well, you have to mail out the confirmation. You have to prepare them. You have to receive them back. You have to do follow-up procedures with the client. Also time-consuming and expensive. So that's why physical examination and confirmation is expensive. Moderate cost will be inspection, analytical procedures, and reperformance. Let's talk about those. Well, inspection. Well, the cost varies depending on who's providing the client, who's providing the document. Is it an original document? How hard is it to retrieve the proper documents from the system? Obviously, if the client is providing you the document, it should be less expensive. If it's an external party, you have to wait for it. Analytical procedures, less expensive than, it's medium expensive than physical examination and confirmation, but auditors prefer them when possible to reduce costs. But remember, analytical procedures, you have to sit down and think about what's the proper analytical procedures, and you have to follow up with questions. So it's a little bit more time consuming, but not the most expensive. Reperformance, well, it all depends on the complexity of what you are reperforming. For example, simple tests are quicker. Complex tests like preparing a bank reconciliation, it could be time consuming. The least expensive type of evidence is, one of them is observation. Observation usually is conducted along other procedures. As you're counting the inventory, you will observe what they are doing. Inquiries also a cheap way to collect evidence. Well, just basically talking to the client informally sometime, and you don't need to, there's no effort in traveling, so on and so forth. You can talk to them on a regular basis. Recalculation, again, involves simple calculation, often done by, a software, Excel, so on and so forth. To summarize real quick, remember the client internal control greatly impact the evidence reliability. Effective control enhance reliability of everything if you have good internal control. Analytical procedures, again, it relies on the information generated from the controls. Unreliable controls will affect analytical procedures. Remember, also effective internal control will make physical examination and recalculation highly reliable. Remember, there were, physical examination and recalculation were high on everything except, well, it depends on the internal control. Remember, solely relying on inquiries is not a good evidence. So you want to make sure to remember that don't rely on the client inquiries for evidence. It should be supplemented, corroborated with other source of evidence. Let's take a look at this multiple choice question to test our knowledge. Let's take a look at this multiple choice questions from Farhat lectures. The auditor measures audit evidence by its reliability, and this is what we discussed today, and its relevance. Which of the following is considered the most reliable evidence? So, knowing the type of evidence that we have is good, but knowing how to rank the evidence is even more important, and that's why auditing as a course and the CPA exam is more challenging, because you could have different level of evidence. So here we're looking for the most reliable, the highest of the four. So we have to look at all four and kind of start to make the judgment to eliminate certain answers. Starting with the account balance of general ledger. A, would you say this is, what type of evidence is this? This is internal evidence. This is account balance of the general ledger. This is provided by the client. I'll have to look at more. I mean, I'm just gonna, just hold on this. B, customer account receivable confirmation. Well, confirmation is coming from a third party. Well, that's a good answer. I would say at this point I would eliminate A, because between A and B, I can eliminate A. B is a better answer, but I have to look at the other options. C, an internal memo that explained the issuance of credit memo. Again, it's an internal memo. It's an internal memo. A and C are the same, and B can be A and C, so therefore C is out. Let's see between B and D. Receiving report issued by the receiving department. Again, same concept here. We're discussing internal documents versus external document. D is an internal document. B is a confirmation. Confirmation comes from a third party, from the customer, someone outside the company. B is the most reliable evidence. It doesn't mean we don't use the other evidence. We might use them, but the question here is we could use them in different contexts. But the question here is which one is the most reliable? They're all evidence. The most reliable is B. What should you do now? Go to Farhat Lectures, look at additional MCQs, true, false. That's going to help you understand the reliability of evidence. Remember, the evidence has to be sufficient and appropriate. Those are important concepts. Good luck. Study hard.
Stay safe.